To do our work, to come into deep knowing of who we are, that's the stuff of bringing down systems of oppression. And so capitalism in its current form couldn't survive. Patriarchy in its current form couldn't survive. White supremacy in its current form couldn't survive if enough of us set about the work of reclaiming the human spirit. That's Angel Kyoto Williams. I'm Carl Baccelleri, and in the spirit of that, I would like to speak a little bit about what I'm learning around the relationship of sensitivity to power and of power to destiny. And I'd like to start with a story. It's a famous Zen story. And it begins with a monk walking in an ancient forest in the evening. And by the evening, I mean tonight. And by an ancient forest, I mean everywhere we are. And by a monk, I mean each one of us when we're walking in our warriorship in this life. And as we're walking through this forest of life, a huge tiger comes at us, thick-furred and wild, and naturally we back away. Everything in us knows we have to get away from the pain of this experience, and we back ourselves up to a cliff. Jumping off of the cliff as a last-ditch attempt to survive, we fall and grab a hold of a root. Looking up, the tiger is unable to reach us, and it seems for a moment that maybe we've been successful. But looking down, we see that our solution has somehow brought about the existence of another tiger. And so there we are hanging by this root in the fading light of evening. And suddenly we notice on the side of the cliff is growing a bush. And on this bush are growing the most beautiful, delicious-looking strawberries that we've ever seen. And so we risk, and we take a hold of this fruit, and we put it in our mouth, and we bite, and it is tart and sweet and delicious. And like any good Zen story, it leaves you right there, hanging on the side of the cliff. And like any good koan, it's the meaning that you want to make of that is yours. But I would offer this for the purposes of our talk, which is that we might think of the first tiger as not an actual tiger. This is a story that the Buddha has told, and so we know that it's about the inner journey. And so if the first tiger is the pain of experience, if the first tiger is the internal thoughts, feelings, sensations, emotions that we can't bear and we need to get away from, then stepping off the cliff and holding on to this root, we look down, and that second tiger is the consequence of that avoidance. It is the accumulation of the grief and the pain that we haven't been willing to feel, and the automaticity of the behaviors that begin to form in ourselves, in our bodies, to make sure that we keep staying away from the pain. Carl Jung famously said, "Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our life, and we will call it fate." So I think that's a simple way to talk about what I'm saying about the second tiger, that in our efforts to get away from the pain of experience, we create the conditions of another kind of longer-term suffering. And this gripping onto the root, this attempt to stay away and to constrict our behavior and restrict our aliveness, is what Stephen Hayes, the creator of acceptance and commitment training, calls experiential avoidance. And the great irony of experiential avoidance, he points out, and this is the result, he's just written this book after 30 years as a researcher, not as a Buddhist, but actually as a language theorist who came to the same conclusions. It's actually really beautiful that way. And he came to see that, like transdiagnostically, there's nothing that predicts human suffering more than experiential avoidance. That the attempt to not have the pain that we're already having creates the conditions of long-term suffering. And it's not just that it's the long-term suffering, but we actually cut ourselves off from the sensitivity of knowing which are the experiences that nourish us and sustain us and which ones are actually dangerous. So that lack of sensitivity then creates more of a predisposition towards fate. Which leaves us, in terms of our story, with one last metaphor, which is the strawberry. And it seems like the story is ending here, but I think it's actually where it picks up. Because this is the first moment in the story that the monk, ourselves, have actually reached for something that we long for, that we yearn for, like desire, joy, appreciation. We're beginning to hold experience in a completely different way. And so the choice between two tigers dissolves. To go a little further into this, walk with me into the Tao Te Ching, which is a root text of Taoism, verse 50. I don't know if this is because I'm turning 50, but verse 50, I love it. And the first half of it basically says, 9 times out of 10, 9 out of 10 of us, we're figuring out some way to avoid the first tiger, the second tiger, or both. There's an attempt to sort of manage life. But when we can be that rare, when we can be that one that holds life and is good at holding life, as it says, then we don't need to avoid tigers or rhinos or spears, as it turns out. But it's not because we've become invulnerable. It's not because we've put on armor. But actually the exact opposite, that our sensitivity has created a different kind of protection, such that I love the language, that the tiger finds no place to sink its claws. Why is that? And the idea here is that for that one, there is no dangerous place. Meaning, when we've been willing to do our work, when we've stepped in and touched our grief, when we're willing to feel the pain of experience, then we're less and less inclined, and we have to be careful here because systems of oppression and the actual acts of aggression in this world do come from the outside. But within ourselves, the more we can attune to the sensitivity of what is actually nourishing to us, the more attuned we can become to the people and circumstances and situations that call us forward into the life that we want for ourselves, that is, feels like destiny, and are less and less inclined to, like as Jung put it, unconsciously create the conditions that bring about the tiger's claw. And so how can it be that for this one there is no dangerous place? Because we're already proactively reaching into the grief and becoming friends with it. About 2 years ago, I came to my own choice point. I've had a wave of loss and grief of my own. A relationship that I had been in that seemed really promising dissolved. This was all in the period of a couple of months. My only child went off to college, which was beautiful and also a major change of an era. The company that I had been giving my best to for 10 years finally failed, and my father passed away. And in that wave of grief, I could feel myself tightening up and not wanting to experience what I was experiencing, and I could feel a possibility of a destiny that I wanted to reach for, and I didn't feel like I had the bridge to get there. I could sense like I was in a moment, like fate was about to become my reality. And at that time, I had been training at the Mogadao Institute in New Mexico, driving down once or twice a month, and I made a decision. It's one of those either-or moments. And I decided to come down and apprentice full-time and live this 50th year in my body. And it's those forms that I like to show to you as a way to talk about what do we actually do? I mean, all of this is so beautiful, but what do you actually do? And so this is an embodied practice. I think a way to talk about Qigong that makes sense from a Western perspective is, as Richard Strozzi Heckler, he's a pioneer in the world of embodied leadership. And he talks about a generative or ontological practice as a kind of a conscious choice to embody a behavior before the circumstance has arrived. So how can we actually lean into destiny prior to the moment actually occurring? So it's a kind of being level training. It's a kind of body first, bottom up choice to reach into experience in such a way that we're inviting it, and in the same way that we might reach towards a destination or into a destiny, we can actually become the destination for those experiences to arrive. So I want to share some of these forms with you, and I just want to note the specialness of this evening. In the 30-year tradition of Mogadao, which is an original Qigong form created by Zhen Dao, it's never been filmed. It's always only ever been taught directly between teacher and student. And over time, I've certified and teach directly with students, but it's never been filmed before. And so I really appreciate and thank you, Zhen, for the opportunity to offer this. And just to be clear, it's not a training video per sense. It's much more an opportunity, I think, to share something from my heart to you right now. So this is called the Heretic Series. And this pose is the first pose in this form. And what we're really getting at here is that intentional stance to relate to experience prior to circumstance. Similar to meditation, where we might let go of a thought and come back to our breath as a preparation for being able to do that in real life. Letting go of a attachment to an idea, for example. But there are other maneuvers of consciousness that we might engage with our bodies. And in doing this, we're actually creating, and I'm realizing I've got one more slide for you. We're actually creating what Rumi, and I think Rumi actually nails it in a really short period of time. He says, we made the body, cell by cell. We made it. All world's horse stance. And we can move down and actually reach into the support and energy of the earth to create a kind of protective barrier within which there's softness, and a softness of breath and softness of heart, but at the same time a strong boundary and the repelling of harmful influences. And then relaxing into sensitivity and reaching up and exposing ourselves to the horizon, we can come back down into a yin power stance and say yes to reality as it is, and cultivate the capacity to harmonize and get into rapport with the truth of experience as it's actually happening. But then keep moving, because there's also the yes to what could be, and to reach in the essence of yang, in abject vulnerability to what could be, even if we don't know how it's going to go. And refining our intention, we can begin to cultivate the powers of our warriorship. How can we show up wholeheartedly and discern what our next action is and reach again? And coming back from there, how do we return to our innocence, to our existential vulnerability, and realign with our personal mythology, with the vertical axis of our participation in the world, and draw down the reality that we would stand for, and become reliable and eloquent, and moving across now into the possibilities of our leadership, where our word is needed to pierce a lie, or to offer a blessing, and to bring our leadership and our wisdom where it's needed. And finally, to bring that confidence and that discernment into a vulnerability of open-heartedness that holds impregnable boundaries, and frames the willingness to bring our heart's gift into the world. And then plainly to let it go, to surrender, and to be willing to just walk into the next moment. Thank you.